All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for coming out on this potentially, well, it will be a scary night, but thank you. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I want to maximize the time we have with Professor Smith. My name's Caroline Bix. I'm the inaugural Stephen E. King Chair in Literature here at the University of Maine. The chair was established in the University of Maine Foundation with a generous gift from the Harold Alfond Foundation in honor of UMaine's distinguished alum, Stephen King, and his creative impact. The goal of the chair is to promote and support the humanities, not just within the university, but in the communities beyond it. I wanted to invite James Smith to be a part of the King Chair's lecture series because his research, his writing, and his activism epitomize the spirit of its mission. James Smith is an associate professor of English and Irish studies at Boston College. He's the author of the book Ireland's Magdalene Laundries and the Nation's Architecture of Containment. The laundries were workhouses in which many Irish women and girls were effectively imprisoned because they were perceived to be a threat to the moral fiber of society. They were operated by Catholic religious orders from the 18th century until as recently as 1996. Smith's archival research was instrumental in exposing the Irish state's complicity and involvement with the laundries. His book is, in Colin McCann's words, a brilliant, art-driven examination of a story or history that needs to be told over and over and over again, lest it be forgotten or allowed to seep into the ambient noise. Smith is one of 5 members of Justice for Magdalene's research, the advocacy group that's made sure this history is not only heard, but reckoned with. They have brought these institutions to the attention of the UN Committee Against Torture in Geneva and were responsible for getting the Irish state to issue a public apology in 2013 and to develop a plan to provide reparations for the laundry survivors. Smith's work has helped mobilize real social and political change, and just as important, has helped many individual women find some emotional peace and material ease. The Justice for Magdalene's research group and its oral history project in particular has given some of these survivors the opportunity to tell their stories, often for the first time, to be heard and to be believed. On October 28, 2008, one of these women, Catherine, read a review of James Smith's book and called him in his office to start telling her story. That woman would become the heart behind much of the Justice for Magdalene's work, the spark that set off the political campaign. Smith would go on to interview her for the Oral History Project, and in that interview, they each remembered that phone call. It's a transcript. You'll have to imagine I'm speaking in brilliant Irish accents. I just wanted to know what this writer was writing about, Catherine says, to see if he has the same version as I have. And I would love to talk to him and straighten him out if there's anything wrong. She laughs. So anyway, that's how I met you. Then Smith tells her, without you, I want you to know that without you, and without you lifting the phone and having the wherewithal to lift the phone and ask for help and say, what can we do about this? You know, it was so important. So realize your story is so much more than your story. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Smith.
Good evening, everyone. I just need to get myself set up here. Just bear with me. So, first of all, thank you for coming out, especially on a night like tonight. Really appreciate it. I also just want to say thank you to Caroline Bix for that wonderful introduction, for her very kind invitation. I'm very pleased to speak as part of the Stephen E. King Chair Lecture Series. I'd also thank Caroline for all the work that went into organising my visit and for hosting me. I especially appreciate the fact that she made space in this series for this important issue. Not only is the month of March ubiquitously Irish at some level, certain events take place next week, but also tomorrow, March the 8th, is the International Women's Day. And so on both those fronts, I hope that my talk tonight strikes a chord. In a moment, I'll show a brief clip from one of the most inspiring Magdalene survivors, beyond Catherine, who has had an indelible impact on me and on my life. But one of the other women, Mary Merritt, and she's just one of the many women that I've come to know over the last 9 or 10 years. But for now, I just say 3 things. I think there's a threefold objective in my talk this evening. First is to continue to tell the story about Ireland's Magdalene women, a story that is still, even as of yesterday, imperiled by state inaction. And one of the things JFM research wants to do is to make sure that that never happens. Second, I'd want to underscore that the advocacy work that I became involved in through the JFM campaign is the work of the humanities and the work of the liberal arts. And to the students in the audience in particular, I hope you will note the explicit connections between the role that archival research, storytelling, testimony gathering, public writing, and advocacy have played in the JFM campaign, and the work that you do in your classrooms here at the University of Maine, especially your humanities and liberal arts classrooms. Work that's rooted in that indispensable skill set that will never go out of fashion, namely close and careful reading, critical thinking, persuasive writing, adept research, and presentation and articulation of your ideas. And finally, thirdly, I hope that in this lecture, you will identify with the impulse to be informed and engaged citizens in the world and of the world, and that you realize that you can and that you do make a difference by asking questions, by staying informed, by persevering despite the odds. The story of the JFM campaign is the story of the pebble in the pond. I hope, therefore, that the JFM campaign might model good, if not best practice, that can be deployed around other issues of human rights and social justice. But now I'll begin with Mary Merritt. Mary is now 87 years of age, 87 years young. She remains fiery and impassioned. And I begin with her voice this evening just to signal that many Magdalene survivors are now speaking for themselves and that they are their own best advocates. Certainly Mary Merritt, and indeed Catherine, who unfortunately is no longer with us, would be the first to tell you that they don't need Jim Smith to talk for them. It would be a brave man indeed that would attempt to do so. But women in Ireland did not always speak out about the experience of being confined in a Magdalene laundry, and many still don't. And in order to understand why, I want to begin first to turn to some historical context. And I'm going to move quickly through this, but I'm very happy to stay here as long as there are questions afterwards. I'll do my best to answer each and every one. So what was a Magdalene laundry? These were institutions that were originally philanthropic in a time when there were no such thing as a welfare state, and that many women needed help. They became increasingly recarceral in an Irish context. And as Caroline said in her introduction, the first Magdalene laundry goes back to 1768, and the last one closed in 1996. They came, in fact, at many levels, they became more recarceral after Ireland gained its political independence in 1922. They were operated after the famine, predominantly by Catholic religious sisters, but there were lay-managed and Protestant-managed Magdalene laundries. And like everything else in the north of Ireland, certainly in the 20th century, right up through the 1970s, there were both Catholic and Protestant Magdalene laundries in the city of Belfast, as there was sectarian division in all aspects of society up to the peace process. Women were called penitents. It's the only word by which these women were called, certainly through the 1960s. And the women worked at laundry and other for-profit enterprises. These were commercial laundries. They did business with the ordinary and everyday people of Ireland, with families as well as with hotels. So people knew about them. People brought their laundry to them. This was an open secret. The Magdalene Laundries were neither uniquely Catholic nor especially Irish. They were a worldwide phenomenon, including here in the United States. There was one in Boston up until 1960. The Good Shepherd sisters, who operated Magdalene Laundries in Ireland, operate here in the state of Maine. The conditions, based on survivor testimony, the conditions for women and girls were defined by the fact that women were locked in. These were prison-like institutions. They were denied freedom of movement and therefore freedom of association. They were returned by the Gardaí, which is the Irish police, as Mary Merritt just testified to, if they escaped. Women were never paid for their labour. So some people call that slavery. The human rights language for it is forced and compulsory labour. And they were denied their given names. So they were given a religious name upon entry into the institution. They were also given institutional garb. So these were total institutions as defined by Michel Foucault. The daily routine emphasized prayer, silence, and work. Many survivors recall haircutting, deprivation of food, solitary confinement as forms of punishment. A woman had to be signed out of a Magdalene. Now, there's a misnomer that if you were in a Magdalene, you were pregnant, you got pregnant outside of marriage. There were some women in the Magdalenes who were unmarried or single mothers. But the majority of Irish unmarried mothers would have gone to an institution called a mother and baby home, which has overriding and similar characteristics to a Magdalene laundry, but are also distinct. So for many survivors of the laundries, they feel especially a pejorative stereotype, and that they must have been a fallen woman, they must have got pregnant, they must have been somehow morally loose, and that's just not the case. Many women remain to live, work, and ultimately die behind the convent walls. The four religious orders in Ireland most associated with these institutions were the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity. They're both indigenous Irish religious congregations. And the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity and the Good Shepherd Sisters, which are both French in origin. And that would have had an impact, and I can talk about that in terms of the nature of the relationship with the local ordinary, with their local bishop, versus with a mother house in France. These orders also managed state residential institutions for children, so industrial and reformatory schools, which were also examined in Ireland in the 1990s. And as I mentioned already, the two latter orders, the two French orders, did operate here in the United States. Just very quickly, that's a sense of where they were in Ireland. It's interesting that they're all south. I don't know that means anything, or that it especially means that families in the north of Ireland or the northern and western provinces, where I'm from myself, were somehow immune to these situations. I doubt it. But the last Magdalene Laundry ceased operating as a commercial entity in 1996, in October 1996, at which time there was a population of 44 women, the youngest in her late 30s, the oldest in her upper 70s. And they have continued to live in the care of, quote unquote, of the religious sisters. Just to underscore also in terms of survivors, there's not a one-size-fits-all model, and we in JFM tend to think about the community of survivors across 5 distinct groups. Women who, in the last 10 years especially, have increasingly began to speak out and demand justice. But for many women, especially women we're talking about in their 60s, 70s and 80s of a certain generation, especially those still in Ireland, but also perhaps those in Irish America who came to America and lived in a parish and were closely identified with parish life as part of the Irish diaspora in remaking their life here in the US. These women are still constrained by a sense of stigma and live in silence and a sense of deep shame. The apology did much to alleviate that, but there are still women who work with JFM but do not want to speak to the media, as is their right, absolutely. There are survivors who are dependent still. There's a population of about 17 women left who are living in the care of the religious orders, who have been deemed to lack capacity in order to control their own financial lives. And the state is attempting to solve that dilemma since 2013. There are victims who have died, both women who died behind convent walls, but also many women who left the laundries and have subsequently died. And that there are children and there are many families impacted by not knowing, not having access to records, not being able to know their family histories. Adoption in Ireland is closed. Adoption was introduced legally in 1952, but throughout the 40s and 50s, Ireland was sending children here to the United States, about 2,200 children, Ireland's banished communities. And for all of those, adopted domestically and adopted overseas, you cannot and you are not entitled in 2018 to your birth cert. It is one of the last bricks in the kind of wall of silence, and that has so defined Catholic Ireland in the 20th century and into the 21st century. Ireland now has constitutional protections for equal marriage, but you cannot get your birth certificate if you're adopted. So I just will move and talk briefly about how I came to this project, which was as an academic. That's what I am, first and foremost. I wrote a book, and prior to that I wrote a dissertation that looked at Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, and industrial and reformatory schools. But ultimately, in revising the dissertation for the book, I focused on the laundries for two reasons, perhaps. One was that it was in the 1990s that there were the first cultural representations. So the first play by Patricia Brogan, it's a wonderful play called Eclipsed. The first documentaries, Washing Away the Stain, which was a BBC Two Scotland documentary, and a documentary by Steve Humphreys, Sex in a Cold Climate, which is fully available on YouTube. It's a wonderful documentary. So that began to happen, cultural representations of this elided history. And simultaneously, the first women began to speak to these documentary filmmakers, and a few of them began to speak in public. And I felt, I suppose, I was drawn to the laundries also because I saw that the state was responding to children who had experienced abuse in industrial and reformatory schools and were passing by, maybe discriminating against these institutional survivors. I always argued that there could be no history. My book could only offer a partial history because the religious orders do not provide access to the records for any woman who entered a laundry after the 1st of January 1900. So we have a lot of information about women who were there in the 19th century, and even for women who entered prior to the turn of the 20th century, some of whom did not leave or who did not die into the 1940s. So we have access to that population, but we have no records and no access to records for any woman who entered a laundry after the 1st of January 1900, although those records exist. There are penitent registers and convent annals. So I suppose that the chief thesis of the book was at the time that the laundries exist in the public mind at the level of story, by which I meant cultural representation and survivor testimony, rather than history, archival records, and documentation. And consequently, Irish historians would not write this book. An Irish historian could not write this book because the archival records were not accessible. I came along as someone trained in cultural studies and wrote a book based on the only archives that were available, which were state archives. And then a series of cultural representations. And I finished the book with that call to action, and that I felt deeply that it was for the sakes of these 5 groups of women, these 5 groups of survivors, that recent cultural representations of Ireland's laundries should be recognised as contributing to a collective movement forward toward real action. And then, as Caroline said in the introduction, my phone rang. And literally, I was in Connolly House, where my office used to be, and within 3 seconds, the way Catherine stuttered, the way she was apologetic, the way that she was obviously outside of the remit that she was most comfortable in. But she did lift the phone, and she did call, and we did speak, and there began a wonderful relationship and a great friendship. But in that moment, something that had been an abstraction became material and corporeal and embodied, and urgent. And she said, well, what are we going to do about this? And she put it up to me. And there I was, just got tenure, had this power. To be a faculty member is to be empowered. And it's not in my nature. It's not anything that I trained to do. It's not anything that I saw myself doing. But I had worked with JFM, and the other two prime movers in JFM at the time were both survivors, daughters of Magdalene's, and both adopted. And when Catherine came along, she gave us a reason to kind of stop talking about it and actually attempt to do something. So in the end of May 2009, the Irish government published their 2,600-page report into child abuse in state residential institutions, and called the Ryan Report. And two things struck me about the discussion of the report. One was that in 2,600 pages, the term Magdalene is not mentioned. It's not referenced. It's not in the index. But in volume 3, chapter 18, there is a chapter entitled, and I'll quote, "Residential Laundries, Novitiates, Hostels, and Other Out-of-Home Settings," which any informed reader would read as obviously referring to women who went through the Magdalene Laundries. And the second thing that struck me, that as there was an international media maelstrom responding to the Ryan Report, front page of the New York Times, The Guardian, Australia, it went right across the Anglophone world, and obviously picked up on the discussion in America, which had happened for the last 5 or 7 years prior, which was child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church here in the States. So there was a context for it. But as the report was being discussed in the Dáil, which again is the Irish Parliament, politicians of all parties and none, in discussing the horrors of child abuse, and they were horrible, the Ryan Report talked about sexual abuse in boys' institutions as endemic, not occasional, endemic. So I don't want to take anything away from that. But as politicians talked about that form of abuse and those institutions, they referred to the women in the laundries in the past tense as, oh, they were horrible, but that's all done, that's in the past. And for me, these responses, the report's elision and the political response to it, was not a case of ignoring an aspect of Ireland past. Rather, this was Ireland present. This was Ireland today, deliberately negating Catherine's existence and experience, and the experiences of countless hundreds of Irish women like Catherine, living at home and abroad as part of the nation's diaspora. And again, Catherine's question came back to haunt me. What was I prepared to do about it? So I did what academics do, which is we write. So I took the redress board, the redress document that existed for survivors of industrial schools, and I sat down and I adapted it. And everywhere the word industrial or reformatory or residential institution was mentioned, I put in Magdalene Laundries, and rather than indicating sexual abuse as the primary form of abuse, I talked about physical abuse, humiliation, and loss of opportunity. And I don't have legal training, and I'm not inclined that way, but I just wanted to put it up to them. Together with Mary Steed, who's a fellow member of JFM, we sent it to every TD, every member of Irish Parliament, TDs rather than MPs, and every senator. And I also sent it to Patsy McGarry in the Irish Times, who I'd met once, but on the 4th of July 2009, on a Saturday, on the front page of the Irish Times, Patsy McGarry ran the story. So you need a little bit of luck along the way in doing advocacy work, let me assure you. And as we began to talk and move forward, JFM, especially Mary, Claire and myself, this was before the other two women joined, really, Catherine O'Donnell and Maeve O'Rourke, we already were holding ourselves to two principles as advocates and being involved in advocacy work. One, it's about the women. It's always about the women. It's not about Jim Smith or Claire McEttrick or Mary Steed. Don't make yourself the story. And secondly, do no harm. And it didn't do any harm, but it didn't provoke the response from politicians that we expected. So I want to just, as a way to set the baseline Over the following 7 or 8 months, this was the Irish government's response to a proposal to set up a separate and distinct redress scheme for survivors of the Magdalene Laundries. The Minister for Education, who initially referred to the women as the former employees of the laundry, asserted that they were privately owned and operated, and that the state did not refer individuals, nor was it complicit in referring individuals to the laundries. The Taoiseach, Ireland's Prime Minister at the time, said it was false to make an analogous comparison between the laundries and the children in industrial and reformatory schools. And the Minister for Justice very much passed the buck. Go and talk to the church, go and talk to the religious orders, as if in 20th century Ireland the church and state were ever separate, and they weren't. But this was also the time of the crash. Ireland was going through economic austerity pretty significantly, and the state, having footed the bill to a large extent for survivors of industrial schools, were already positioning themselves to make sure that the bill didn't land at their doorstep. Because of that response, we did a whole series of other things which I won't go into, but we certainly engaged the human rights community and the civic society community in Ireland, working with Amnesty and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and in particular the National Women's Council of Ireland, who I could not say enough good things about in their support and in the direction they gave us. I also met, and I felt it was very important to reach out to the religious orders. I have a series of letters from a series of nuns, all of them telling me that they didn't want to talk to me and that there was nothing to talk about. But I did meet in person with Cardinal Brady and with Archbishop Martin in Dublin, who's a very non-traditional Catholic archbishop in many ways. And I did lots of advocacy journalism, and we began by writing letters to editors. When there was uptake on letters to editors in terms of other people responding to letters to editors, we wrote op-eds, and suddenly people were coming to us. And so we were already, by 2010, setting the agenda. And we were very early adopters of social media, and Ireland is quite engaged with social media. And then we did a lot of media work, which is not a remit, again, that I'm particularly comfortable with. I want to show you a clip, the second clip tonight, from a documentary made by RTE. It was the first time an Irish television station aired a documentary on the laundries. But I want to show this clip to underscore how, in this case, historical archives and historical research can tell a story in the public realm beyond what we write for our papers, for our professors, and what we do as publishing our work in peer-reviewed journals, etc., etc. And again, this wasn't an atmosphere I was necessarily comfortable with, but it was something that I learned to do and that a few of us learned to do. So just bear with me. So as the government and the state were ignoring archival evidence from their own archives, I hasten to add, we felt it was important to up the ante. So under the advice of then Deputy Michael D. Higgins, who's now President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, who at the time was serving on the Board of Directors for the Irish Human Rights Commission, we made an application to the IHRC in April 2010, and later that year in November 2010, they published a 70-page independent assessment, so like a peer review of the evidence, and called on the government to establish a statutory investigation. And of course, nothing happened yet again. So we upped the ante a second time, and having expended our domestic options, we went to the United Nations Committee Against Torture. If there is a UN body that no state wants to be on the bad list for, it's the Torture Committee. And I want to acknowledge that at this juncture, a very young 23-year-old Maeve O'Rourke, remember that name, Maeve had the wherewithal and the passion and the intelligence to take survivor testimony and kind of hackish academic archival material and come up with the legal arguments around human rights bodies and human rights conventions that Ireland was a party to, under which it was obliged to intervene and to ensure that compulsory labour, certainly forced and compulsory labour, cruel and unusual punishment did not exist. So Maeve created those arguments, went to Geneva, spoke before the body, and in June 2011, for the first time, at the first occasion that Ireland was being examined by UNCAT, they came out with a stinging critique of the state and a really strong recommendation which insisted that it was the state's obligation to establish a prompt, thorough and independent investigation, and also it was the state's obligation to ensure that women obtain redress. Within 10 days, the Irish state finally responded, and they established what was called an interdepartmental committee, which was basically an in-house department by department conversation. It certainly would not have met the UN's expectations of prompt, thorough and independent, but at the time JFM welcomed the move because we were ever conscious of the fact that the population of women we were dealing with were of an age where they could not where it was not fair for us to drag it out to make a principled objection, although we did object amongst ourselves. 2 days after the government made the announcement, the religious orders announced, again for the first time, that they would cooperate with the state's interdepartmental committee, and a few days later again it was announced that Martin McAleese, Ireland's first gentleman, and the former the husband of the former, still husband, of the former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, would serve as independent chairperson. So we began working with Martin McAleese and feeding him all the material that we had compiled. We went to Dublin to meet him on 3 occasions. But at the same time, we understood at this juncture that we were going to need to set the bar in terms of international best practice for redress. So again, on this occasion, Maeve O'Rourke and Catherine O'Donnell principally worked on revising the initial redress scheme and submitting it at the request of the government. So they were coming to us at this juncture. And a redress package that would involve a state apology, a dedicated unit to provide services and supports to the women, a one-stop shop, compensation scheme that would be non-adversarial, and transitional justice, a memorial preserving the historical record and ensuring education to young people in Ireland. All the time we were working on our principal submission, which we made in 2012. It was a 145-page document. We had the benefit of a senior barrister who gave us from the UK, who gave us a week of pro bono assistance. So it was much more professional than anything that we could carry out and carry off on our own. But it was 145-page document, 796 pages of survivor testimony, which we'd spent the previous year compiling using University College Dublin's ethical human subject criteria, and we went through an IRB process. And then 3,700 pages of archival documentation. And really the 5 of us, and then Raymond Hill, who was the barrister. We also brought women into Dáil Éireann, into the Parliament, 2 groups of women on 2 occasions to meet with Martin McAleese. It was important that they be empowered to be their own advocates and to give them agency within the process. It's interesting, none of them, and there are lots of women out there who were in front of the media and were talking to the cameras. There was some, I would say, borderline exploitation of survivors, kind of the exotics of trauma going on in certain circles. But the group of women that we worked with wanted to go in unnoticed. So they were chuffed. On one occasion, we entered the rear, which is the VIP entrance. That's the other side of the building. But it was 3 months to the day after Queen Elizabeth, on her first ever official visit to Ireland, had entered the same door, and that seemed to mean an awful lot to the group of women. February 2013, Martin McAleese published his report. It's just over 1,000 pages. It confirmed state involvement in all 5 key areas that were investigated and that JFM had long argued for. In particular, the process by which the state transferred and was complicit in transferring women to the laundries, the ways in which the state supported the laundries by giving them contracts for state laundry contracts for hospitals, for prisons, for state laboratories. Ireland's an agricultural country, lots of state laboratories. State juvenile institutions, state agencies, state departments, as well as semi-state hotels, the ESB, which is semi-state building corporation, the Electrical Supply Board in Ireland. So lots of state contracts were given without a fair wage clause, which had been legislated for in Ireland in 1938, but wasn't applied in the laundry contracts that were given historically to the laundries. And the third area of state involvement were acts of omission, the failure of the state to regulate, to license work practices, to ensure there wasn't underage working, underage labour, which there was, and a whole series of constitutional and human rights obligations that the state omitted to act upon. So there were the three main arguments: referring women, supporting financial contracts, and acts of omission. And it took 2 weeks. It was up in the air, even with the 1,100-page report, even with the report confirming all of the arguments we made. It was touch and go whether or not we'd get the apology. And I'd always argued, because Catherine from very early on said that if there was an apology, I might speak. But in the absence of an apology, there's just no way. Women needed to be told that what happened to them was wrong, that they were wronged, and that we wronged them. And that finally came in a really moving moment, although I've become cynical, unfortunately. But this was the Taoiseach's, the state apology.
Therefore, Cancóla, I as Taoiseach, on behalf of this state, the government and our citizens, deeply regret and apologise unreservedly to all those women for the hurt that was done to them, for any stigma they suffered as a result of the time they spent in the Magdalene laundry. Let me conclude, Cancóla, by again speaking directly to the women whose experiences in the Magdalene laundries have negatively affected their subsequent lives. As a society, for many years, we failed you. We forgot you, or if we thought of you at all, we did so in untrue and offensive stereotypes. This is a national shame, for which I say again, I'm deeply sorry and offer my full and heartfelt apologies. At the conclusion of my discussions with one group of the Magdalene women, one of those present sang Whispering Hope. A line from that song stays in my mind. When the dark midnight is over, watch for the breaking of day. Let me hope that this day and this debate, heralds a new dawn for all those who feared that the dark midnight might never end.
So I wouldn't at all suggest that they were crocodile tears. I don't think they were. I think it was genuine and sincere. It was a very moving moment. But there's a difference between talking the talk and then walking the walk, and unfortunately. So on that same night, the government charged a former High Court judge, Justice Mr. John Quirk, with establishing a scheme. And to his credit, John Quirk went out and spoke to many, many more women because the apology had happened. Just as an indication, he spoke to just under 300 people. Martin McAleese spoke to 118, of which 40 were still confined and living in the care of the religious orders. So the apology made a huge difference. And that he published his commission, the Magdalene Commission report, in May, which was accepted in full by the Irish government at the end of June 2013. And the Restorative Justice Scheme came by way of an ex gratia fund. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but ex gratia, in the gift of the state. Again, that's the double bind. If these women had the time after an apology to go to court, having had a state apology, if they went to court, they would have been entitled to much more and would have received much more. But of course, the government knew that time was not on the women's side. So there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. The ex gratia fund offered lump sum compensation in lieu of lost wages, in fact, in lieu of unpaid wages. It was determined by duration of stay, which became a very thorny issue, as you'll see, because duration of stay could only be proved and documented by the religious orders, and this was not a transparent process. The cash payments ranged from a measly $11,500, euros even, sorry, 11,500 euros, which was the minimum for 3 months, up to 100,000 for women who spent 10 years or more. It was even worse than that because the maximum initial payout was 50,000, and then if you were entitled to more than 50,000, it got paid on a week-by-week basis. But if you died, those monies reverted to the state. There was perhaps the most meaningful and transformative element of the redress scheme was the old age pension, especially for women living in the UK and here in America. To suddenly have an additional €232 a week coming in, and that made a transformative impact on Catherine's life living in Michigan. It was the first time in her life she had money to do little small things for other people. And there was a healthcare package, but that bill was not published until 2015, and the services were only available if you were in Ireland. Now, they were available to people outside of Ireland if they travelled to Ireland. Don't get me started. There was a proposal to have independent advocates for institutionalised women. That has still not happened. This is 2018. We're now just past the 5th anniversary, the 19th of February. And there are still 17 women. There were 44 in 2013. There are 17 women left. And the government can't get their act together to provide independent advocates for women with limited capacity. And nothing has happened on the transitional justice elements, which I'll talk about in a second. The 4 religious orders, on the day that the report was published, through a public relations firm, staggered a series of 4 statements of regret. But to this day, they have not apologised for the treatment of women in Magdalene institutions in Ireland. I would add that prior to this, the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, so the US province of the Sisters of Mercy, offered a very fulsome apology for treatment of women in Magdalene Laundries. But their Irish sisters have not. And on 4 occasions, the government have asked for the religious orders to make a financial contribution, and they have to date, at least, refused to do so. I just very briefly, if I can, take a moment to talk about women in the US diaspora, because that's that's the part of the campaign in the last 2 or 3 years that I've really owned. It just sticks in my craw, excuse the Irishism, some of you might know that term. It galls me that in 2013, the year that the scheme was introduced, coming off the austerity of the crash, the Irish Tourism Board developed this scheme called The Gathering. Oh, come on home, meet your long-lost cousins. Tribes of Irish clans would meet. It was a great success, and it was very necessary, and I don't diminish its economic impact. But there was no effort to gather in the women of the Magdalene Laundries. This scheme, the redress scheme, has not been published in the United States. Ireland has 6 consulates across the United States. They have not disseminated information. In as late as April 2016, I was asked to give a presentation to the Coalition of Irish Immigration Centres, each centre would have a social worker paid for in part by the Irish taxpayer. And when I spoke to them, and it was done by phone with a presentation, I forget the name of the technology, excuse me, but to a person around the table, not a single one of them had heard of the Magdalene redress scheme. And their question to me was, well, how would the women know? So in preparation for that discussion, that's why I remember the date, I'd asked Maureen O'Sullivan, there's a facility in Irish democracy where you can ask a TD, a Member of Parliament, to ask a question on your behalf, which has to be answered by the Minister. It's a great way of getting politicians on the record. We use that all the time. We'd get a question asked, there'd be a response. We'd give the response to the journalist, and they'd write the story. It was an instrumental component in our campaign. But in this case, I was attempting to elicit information about US applicants. So only 11 women applied, and only 8 of those women had their application accepted. And one of those 3 women would become instrumental in my next comment. In preparation for tonight, I asked the Doyle Committee to just give us a sense of where the redress scheme is. So this is the latest figures. 830 women applied. 686 of those applications have been accepted. And those women are in receipt of 25.7 million euros in the way of lump sum compensation, which is not a lot of money. It's not. There are still 17 capacity cases outstanding, and there's 106 applications have been rejected. Over the last 4 years, as women got turned away, and as many, many, many women in the 638 came back to tell us that they felt they were there longer, but the religious orders records didn't justify it. And because this was a scheme determined by duration of stay, and the only archival records available were the religious orders records, the Department of Justice in Ireland, who operated the scheme, gave too much weight to the religious orders and did not listen to the women, did not believe the women, did not accept the women's testimony. It's a version of the Me Too moment. It's a version of not listening to young girls who accused Dr. Larry Nasser. I've been thinking about the overlap. Why do we not trust women when they tell us what happened to them? So as a result of referring women to the Ombudsman, which is another feature of Irish democracy, there is an Ombudsman in Ireland where you can make an official complaint against the state. And just last November, on the 27th of November, they published their report on what they call the maladministration of the Restorative Justice Scheme. And I think the title says it all: opportunity lost. Not only did they not listen to the women and accept the women's testimony, but they ran a scheme not in the spirit of restorative justice. So it's ongoing. There's been no memorial 5+ years beyond the apology, and on the night of the apology, the Taoiseach said that he'd like to ensure that we engage directly with representative groups and as many women as possible to erect a suitable memorial. And that was echoed by Justice John Quirke in his recommendation that we consult with the advisory board, our committee referred to, in establishing a memorial garden, museum, or other form of memorial. And that has not happened. The last Magdalene laundry closed in 1996, as I said. It was on Sean McDermott Street, which is just off O'Connell Street. It's the only inner city location. It is also the only former Magdalene currently in existence and in the ownership of the state, or an agent of the state, Dublin City Council, who put out a proposal for a redevelopment of that area. Now, that area certainly needs redevelopment. It's a very poor area, historically has been a very poor area. The proposal that was accepted by Dublin City Council was from a Japanese hotel chain who build commercial hotels. It's for a 350-room hotel and 140-bed accommodation targeting international fee-paying students. And there are 10 residential units planned, only 4 of which are for social housing, public housing, 6 to be sold on the open market. And this in the midst of what many people describe as the worst public housing crisis in the history of the state. Worse than the worst years of the 40s, 50s and 60s, and they were not easy years. And at a time when there are over 3,000 homeless children on any given night placed in temporary bed and breakfast or hotel accommodation. But what's also notable about the proposal is that there isn't a mention of the Magdalene Laundry and the long-promised memorial to the Magdalene Laundries, which again is an eliding out of all of the traces. These buildings have been razed in New Ross. They've become part of educational institutions, the Waterford Institute of Technology, the Limerick College of Art. The Galway one has been raised, ironically became a branch of Anglo-Irish Bank. For those of you who know what happened in Ireland in the last 10 years, you'll know that Anglo-Irish did not treat the Irish taxpayer pretty well. So there is a deliberate forgetting. So I'll finish, if I can, Caroline, take 3 minutes. I'll finish with just something to make, so that's where things stand as of yesterday. Things are still happening this week. A story in the Irish Times talked about a further 7 women who have died without receiving any money from the state. That was published on Monday. Just to indicate the fact that it's ongoing, Advocacy work is about perseverance. So we're very focused in moving from political activism back into the realm of education. That's what we are. And so honouring the legacy and leaving a legacy by honouring the Magdalene women. That's a picture of the Magdalene consecrate's grave at the Sunderwell Institution in Cork. The Sunderwell Institution was caught up in NAMA, which is the National Asset Management Agency, which was created as a state bank to buy all of the bloated property development that were mired in bad loans as a result of the Celtic Tiger. So this is one of those institutions. It's now wired off. You can't enter. You cannot go and say a prayer. There's barbed wire around the wall. There's a locked gate, and it's inaccessible. We are engaged in an ongoing critique of the McAleese report for a whole series of reasons that I'm not going to talk about, other than the fact that they ignored the written testimony submitted by JFM. They did lots of other things that are problematic, because that's become the official record. It was only ever an interdepartmental committee report. It didn't have powers to compel evidence. It wasn't statutory. But the government is very quick to say, the McAleese report demonstrated. You'll see an example in a second. But they ignored the testimony. And that's just a couple of lines. I'll just let you quickly read them. I won't go through them. That underscore the physical abuse that occurred in these institutions. The McAleese report wasn't a fact-finding or a fault-finding report. It didn't make findings of harm, of gross human rights violations. But the evidence was given to them to be able to do so. And hence the UN has repeatedly called, again and again, as recently as last year, 2017, for a prompt, thorough and independent investigation. So that type of work needs to continue, because this is the face that the state is presenting to the world. No factual evidence to support allegations of systemic torture or ill treatment of a criminal nature in these institutions was found by the McAleese Committee. In light of facts uncovered by the McAleese Committee, and in the absence of any credible evidence of systemic torture or criminal abuse being committed in Magdalene Laundries, the Irish government does not propose to set up a specific Magdalene inquiry body. And the UN have been our best friends in many ways. They're independent, we can't influence them, we can just bring information to their attention. So when Ireland was examined for the second time, every 5 or 6 years, 2011, 2017, they again not only issued a recommendation as they did in 2011, on both occasions, which is really unusual. UNCAT has the facility. So last year I think they issued close to 100 recommendations for Ireland, but within that they have the facility to nominate 4 for what's called follow-up, which means that the state party has to demonstrate progress on that particular recommendation within 12 months. For that to happen once in 2011 was amazing. For it to happen a second time in 2017 on the same issues, it's gratifying to see in particular the state being charged with advertising the scheme abroad, and also to ensure greater access to archives held in private and public bodies, which is also an ongoing issue, that women do not have access to records about them, about their lives, about what happened in their families, in an era when medical history is so important, when genetics are so important. There's a state structure that still inhibits that from happening. The Oral History Project Caroline mentioned is a fantastic contribution organised by my great colleague Catherine O'Donnell, who's at University College Dublin. And I know students in Caroline's class read one of the testimonies from one of the women with Catherine, the interview that I did with Catherine, which is now available through the Justice for Magdalene's research website, including in some cases audio files and ancillary files. So correcting the national narrative, ensuring that any history that will be written from now on will have available to it prima facie evidence from survivors. My other colleague, Claire McGettrick, another fantastic collaborator and colleague who's herself adopted and is now doing a PhD in sociology, working on the history of Irish adoption, is working on what she calls the Names Project, to ensure that every woman who died behind a convent wall in Ireland has the dignity of a name above her grave. Because many of these women were buried in communal graves. Some women were exhumed as late as 1993 and reinterred, exhumed, cremated and then reinterred again anonymously in 1993. So Claire is looking at graves, census records, exhumation licenses, electoral registers, newspaper archives. And just one example, this is one of the legacy cases. So this is someone who was in the laundry in 1911. We know that because the 1911 census in Ireland is online and searchable. So Margaret, or Maggie, Malone died in 1985. It's the same woman, the same date of birth, the same place of birth, at 92 years of age. So she spent 74 years confined, but she's not counted in the Macaleese report because she was there prior to 1922. And the last initiative that we've organised over the last 5 years started in 2012 in Glasnevin in Dublin, and I organised a small one in Galway in Bohermore Cemetery, was to pick a day around International Women's Day when we asked the public to come out and lay flowers on the graves of former Magdalenes in the public graveyards. Some of the graveyards attached to convents are still inaccessible. And this has become an initiative that has brought young people and young families and children. I'll finish with a video clip that just shows you that in action. I won't show you the full 4 minutes, but just to get a taste of it. One of the best things about it, one of the most heartening things about it, is to see young children, which means that future generations will not forget. Before I show you that clip, I'd anticipate you'd want to know what happened with Catherine. Catherine died, unfortunately, in March 2016. She had just turned 81. She had moved from Boston to the Midwest because she was facing homelessness. She had retired as a nursing assistant and spent 15 years living in a basement apartment in return for room and board that she was, or room and board in replacement in return for providing home help and assistance to a woman who, after her 92nd birthday, needed to be hospitalized. The family had to put her in private nursing home. In order to pay for private nursing home, they had to sell the house, and Catherine was looking at being out on the street. And this family, who she knew back in the days when she first came to Boston in the early 1960s, who she stayed in touch with, came to Boston and packed her up and moved her to Michigan and put her in her apartment or in her own place and paid her rent and paid her utilities. So as dark and as sad and as tragic as Catherine's story is, sad certainly and dark, the end of her life, she met wonderful people, and I'd want to always acknowledge that. She never married. She gave all of her possessions away when she moved, but she moved with her 2 dogs and her 42 boxes of books. She received her lump sum for her 4+ years in the laundry, and she also received her pension. I have already signaled the pension just changed her life. She'd bring people for coffee and pay, and to be able to do that gave her such a sense of empowerment and lended her such dignity. She visited Ireland in September 2014, and we arranged for her to get a tour of the Dáil of the Parliament because she couldn't be there the night of the apology, and she was brought for lunch, and she just had such a great time, and people fawned over her and made her feel special because that's what she was. She also visited her mother's grave. Her mother had died when she was 7, and she arranged and spent the rest of her lump sum making the arrangements that her body would be cremated and her ashes would be brought back to her mother's grave, and that happened in the summer of 2016. So without further ado, and I'll take questions, but just to come down off the adrenaline of giving the talk, I won't do it all, just a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes of the flowers from Magdalene's.
I was an unmarried girl, I just turned 27, when they sent me to the sister of the Magdalene laundries. Prostitutes and destitutes and temptresses like me, fallen women sentenced into dreamless drudgery. Why do they call this heartless place Our Lady of Charity? Oh, charity. These bloodless brides of Jesus, if they just once glimpse their groom, then they'd know, and then drop the stones concealed behind their rosaries. They wilt the grass they walk upon, they leech the light out of a room. They'd like to drive us down the drain at the Magdalene laundries. Peg O'Connell died today. She was a cheeky girl, a flirt. They just stuffed her in a hole. Surely to God you'd think at least some bells should ring. One day I'm gonna die here too, and they'll plant me in the dirt, like some lame bulb that never blooms. Come any spring, not any spring. No, not any spring. Not any spring.
Last weekend, Ireland had a historic storm. So the country closed down. So all of the events that were due for last weekend are scheduled to take place this weekend. So folks, I'll answer any questions you'd like to ask.